So, Professor Hagemann, thanks for sitting down with us at the Oxford Political Review today, and we're really delighted to have you. And so there's been a lot of debates lately about what's being taught in classrooms, particularly in the US, for example, which speaks to a broader discussion on, what is the purpose of education itself. And so on that premise, I'd like to ask you the first question, which is, I saw on your Twitter that you shared an article from The Economist a few days ago that's arguing for universities to focus more on degrees that are more likely to increase students' financial returns post-graduation, right? So such as computer science or law. And some would say this is particularly necessary in a context like the US, where graduates are straddled with exorbitant levels of debt. And they may have to keep paying back till 40 or 50. So do you think that that's a correct approach, right? That universities should gut degrees, like, for example, in the humanities, such as philosophy or literature or classics, that have very little financial utility, because this is an approach that people like, for example, Peter Thiel has advocated for.
So let's just be clear about one thing first, which is that humanities certainly have a financial utility. So I'd like to just push back on that as an assumption. But also we of course need to think about, one thing is the income level that graduates go out into a job market and the industries that they get jobs within. Something else is the financing of education and what kind of objectives you have in a society for educating your population. And I would also stress that the UK is facing some of the same challenges and dilemmas as in the US, in terms of the access to education and the inequalities in education that are pronounced in the US, but they're certainly also pronounced in other places of the world and in the UK for sure. So I think that there are very important considerations that are brought into this article and into this debate in particular. And that has to do with what education is in our societies, and they are of course essential in an economic sense, but it's also important in terms of a social and political sense as well. So you can use educational systems to design your industries and your economies, and with the kinds of economic at the moment, it's of course understandable that education and funding of education is on the agenda. I think this article, that you referred to, I don't know if we should discuss that in particular, but certainly the premise that it's the only measure for successful educational systems is the income levels of the graduates. That's a misunderstanding to go down that route. Yeah. There is a need for the humanities, and you could argue that there's a particular need for the humanities or for the social sciences at a time where we are, living in a digital age. We need to understand behavior. We need to understand relations. We need to understand human philosophy and thinking, as we also see that our populations are facing different challenges, for example, related to well-being and health, which is costly in society too. So I think that I'd like to firmly rebuke the argument that we should only provide degrees in areas that seem profitable from the outset in terms of student income. And the other element is, of course, in all of this, how do you finance higher education? And that's been a long-standing debate in US, UK, and the Scandinavian countries. I've just moved to Denmark, started working here a year ago from having been in the UK for 20 years. And it's a very different model here. You know, education is paid for. In fact, you get paid to take to do a degree. And that causes a debate currently as the government is looking to reorganize university degrees and also cut down on the cost of the very expensive higher education you have in Denmark.
I mean, it's interesting when you brought up the Scandinavian model. I was in Denmark last month as well, and had some firsthand exposure to how the education model is kind of structured there. So, and there's been a lot of research done on how globally that stratification increases inequalities in education and attainment. But then in Nordic countries like Denmark, which has been touted often as like a model on how to keep that inequality low by either eliminating or minimizing streaming or tracking through things like comprehensive schooling. And so that's been often celebrated. But a lot of relatively recent research, such as those done by your colleague, Mads Jaeger, that shows that maybe that's no longer the most accurate picture, right? Because neoliberal reforms since the 90s have meant A, stratification and even marketization is a bit more prevalent than one expects. And then also B, that Nordic countries have now sort of diverged in the approach, right? Sweden's a bit different from Finland now, it's a bit different from Denmark. Do you think that there is still this overriding Nordic model of education today, and does it remain sufficiently egalitarian in your opinion?
So if you take like the very big perspective, I do think that there's a Scandinavian model which differs from the other models we see whether in Europe or in the world. And the main point is that everyone has the right to an education. Everyone with the qualifications needed can get into the degrees. So there is complete open enrollment in that sense. However, it is also true that the comprehensive education at the younger ages has not led to the social equality push that that politicians thought it would. So there is inequality in terms of the people that come into to the university are usually from backgrounds where there are parents with some degree of education and with some level of income. It is we don't see a lot of social mobility in Denmark. So it has failed in that respect. Now, the inequalities between different social classes are not as big as they are in, for example, the UK. So I think that it would be wrong to say that inequalities resemble that of the UK or even the US, where they pronounce different, people simply do not have the option at all. It's out of the question to get into university if you cannot get the funding or and either provide that yourself or get scholarships. And that's not the case here. But we do have a problem with getting, more diversity into universities in general. that's diversity on all dimensions, but also in terms of social inclusion. Now, there is at my university, we've started a push to try and address this. And the question is if it's, it's how to work together with what would be the equivalent of sixth forms or secondary schools to help students from less privileged backgrounds understand that they have the option, because that's also part of the problem. Kids simply not knowing and being guided into which available educational paths they can choose from. So it's despite the access to education, we see that young people make choices that follow those of their parents. And that means that the social mobility is not very, very strong.
Do you think that, for example, Sweden and Denmark and Finland have diverged in their education policies since the 90s or 80s?
So I'm actually not an expert on this, and I'm myself fairly new to the Scandinavian educational system, because I've been abroad for so long. So I can't tell you in any detail. I know that there are very different government policies, and I'm sure it's had an effect, but I can't tell you in what ways this is now what kind of effects it's had.
Okay. The other question I have, since you've been in the UK for so long and was in LSE, the FT published an article yesterday defending the role of Oxbridge in UK public life. But I think that also applies to institutions like LSE and UCL. And this is in response to this growing backlash against having an Oxbridge degree or an elite degree, and that's considered a little out of touch these days. And also a perception that's becoming increasingly common in the UK, especially with populism rising. In the US, there's a similar complaint voiced against the Ivies. So do you agree with that sentiment, that elite universities perpetuate a cycle of inequality that is a bit unhealthy? Or do you think that pursuing a good education shouldn't be stigmatized? And I'm asking this because in Europe, for example, the prestige and ranking of universities seem to matter a lot less. And some say it's a better system.
No, I would disagree with that. I think that excellence in university degrees is viewed quite similarly in Europe. But the problem is who has had access to those degrees over the past decades. I absolutely find it necessary to have excellent educational systems and institutions, and that there will always be some that stand out in that respect. I think that that's not the problem. The problem is who can get into those degrees and universities, and whether they are diverse and inclusive also for the alumni. So I think that the real issue, and here UK differs from the US and the Ivy League system, but the UK, with very few universities and a very almost club-like membership of those universities dominating the public life and public offices. I think that historically that has been a huge problem and still is. But ensuring that those institutions develop, and my university and the University of Copenhagen is also an elite university, but with a broader public profile. But nevertheless also has to take these dilemmas or these challenges very seriously. I firmly believe that we should never go down the track of a populist approach to getting rid of elite educational systems. However, they should be open and to all qualified applicants, and they need to work hard to ensure diversity on all of the dimensions of diversity that we know are important. So I would never argue for, you know, getting rid of excellent research and educational programs. We need to have places where that is further encouraged and developed, but at the same time, of course, ensuring the access is a fair one.
Okay. The other question I have, based on your experience of being in the UK, is, you know, the UK is a devolved country, and a lot of countries, like for example in Spain, also has a similar approach, which is education is very much decentralized, and you know, some would say that how decentralization affects A, education spending, and B, education outcome is a bit under-researched. So with Denmark, where you are, being one of the more decentralized countries in Europe, actually, not in the federal level, not in the federal sense, but just decentralization, would you say more decentralization leads to higher education expenditure and outcomes, as the literature suggested with, say, government size or social expenditure?
So I think we're looking at very, very different models here, because, you know, the universities in Denmark are public. The public universities, they are highly regulated to a degree that I've been very surprised by, but they're highly regulated, and but nevertheless have external funding from in research in particular, is of course also a very big chunk of the budget, as well as the activities. Now we need to keep in mind one thing, which is that Denmark is a country of 6 million people, and the university here is very big. It's more than 40,000 students, but it's nevertheless difficult to make any generalizations saying, you know, one model or the other in terms of centralization will lead to different spending models, at least to my knowledge. Maybe there are people who've researched this in detail who would give you some better answers to this. But I think that what is important is, of course, how funding enables research activities and educational programs which are academically founded rather than steered or politically influenced.
I was also asking that because decentralization's effect tend to be more prominent on the primary and secondary education level, instead of, say, tertiary, because a lot of the, for example, like comprehensive schooling, I think, is kind of governed and regulated by local districts or municipalities, if I'm not wrong.
Well, to some degree. I mean, the funding, yes, partly, but it's still a ministry which you know regulates all aspects of curriculum and the whole process of providing also primary and secondary education. So it's not. There's decentralized administration, but not decentralization of regulation and budgets.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's complicated, but it's also, you know, again, the whole. I find, you know, it to be an important point that the whole fact that it's a small country with close collaborations between local councils and central government out to the actual educational institutions, you know, it's very close relationships and distances as well compared to the UK or the US for that matter. Yeah.
Okay, absolutely. So we spoke about the purpose of education earlier, or touched on it, but education often serves a function of it, indoctrination as well, even though that's considered a negative word, but indoctrination, but instilling values and ideologies, right, to students, in the name of preparing them to be quote unquote good and informed citizens, whatever you want to define that. And it's very different in a democratic or authoritarian country. There's a common criticism these days, particularly from the right, though, that the universities have become this left-wing liberal echo chamber where students are only encouraged to be progressive. Oftentimes, you know, they will say because the majority of faculty is. And the conservative views are...
Well, can I just push back on that? Because there's no evidence to suggest that there is more left-leaning academics than that. You know, there is no evidence for any of those points of criticism, and certainly no evidence that that's also what's then translated into a classroom setting.
Okay.
So I don't find it relevant to discuss whether, you know, there is more of, you know, this would, you know, university's been around for centuries, and we have had in the European democracies, we've had left-wing and right-wing governments, and that would not have been the case if we had only educated left-wing policies through universities, and that's also the case today.
Yeah, no, I mean, that was the question I was going to ask. Part of the question I was going to ask. But I mean, also the reason why I mentioned this question is because maybe in Europe it's less common, but in the UK and especially in the US, for example, you see these instances of you know, like students protesting against professors for some of their views that many consider to be, you know, not so pleasant, or maybe because they're sometimes it's conservative professors, they'll say this is not okay, they shouldn't be taught in lectures and classrooms. So my question is, do you think free speech, this idea of free speech, right, is being stifled across universities, or whether the diversity of thought is being limited? Because we did an interview with Chris Patton, who's the chancellor of Oxford earlier, and then he said that that's the case.
I think that there has been, you know, there are some very important debates around academic freedom and free speech, etc. Whether in media, public media, so that previously, and certainly now within the universities, and the whole debate around the Chicago principles, and translated into a European setting. I think it's extremely important. My personal opinion is that we need to have these discussions and debates, both among students as well as amongst faculty, and be aware of the responsibilities that come with free speech. So in Denmark, this has been a very, very tense debate, also because we had in the media a big case with the drawing of cartoon drawings of the Muhammad, and that led to a very, very long and complicated discussion about free speech, but also about responsibilities in the public sphere. Now I see that as relevant into universities as well. And I think that it is important for universities to take a stand on the whole dilemma of free speech and ensuring the rights of minorities and an inclusive environment. So that's the approach I have to this, that there is of course, you know, freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and also academic freedom in our research and teaching, but always with the consideration of making our universities an inclusive and diverse environment for everyone to feel safe and comfortable and belonging to. And I find that that's an extremely important stand to take from the university leaderships.
Okay, absolutely, yeah. And the other thing I have is, on a more academic note, my professor, Jane Gingrich, she argued that pinning political hope on the traditional education system as a primary means to equalize opportunities in society is a bit it's a bit illusory now, because we've realized the way systems operate depends on the level of existing inequality in the labor market. And so some would say, David Soskis in LSE has suggested this, but maybe the better solution is to invest more in further education, especially in the knowledge economy, which, from what I understand, Denmark does really well, or to revitalize alternatives to universities, such as shorter, more vocational focused college degrees. That's what Soskis said, particularly in the UK and other liberal economies. Do you agree with, for example, Professor Gingrich's argument? And should liberal economies introduce the same kind of further education policies that you see in Denmark to address this need for a fairer economy?
I think it's really important to see the educational systems as not only how to feed a labor market that goes in, it develops in waves and in different directions. It is also about shaping the economies. So I think it's a good point. But I think that at the same time, research shows which kind of educational steps have different effects for society. So depending on, of course, on what kind of economy you have, you may want to consider whether you are feeding into a knowledge economy, whether where your labor market demands are also in the next 20 years, say.
Yeah.
Migration is an important aspect to keep in mind here too. But the aspects of which institutions are the right ones in which kind of economy, I think that's, you can have universities. So universities in Denmark, there was a push for the more technical colleges and professional degrees to become more academic in the 2000s. And you could say that maybe that now shows to have been a mistake, as we have fewer nurses, we have fewer carpenters, we have fewer students going into those directions of education. But the universities nevertheless provide in Denmark provide people with higher education and high chances of employment. There's a very low unemployment rate currently.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I'm answering your question so well, but nevertheless, I think that these different building blocks of educational degrees, we shouldn't change them too often. We need to have a view, the long-term view on what kind of economies we have, but also which kind of economies we will have in the future, and what we are feeding into. And I would stress that in Europe, the question of migration is an important one as our demographics change. So the economic premises for making these decisions are one thing, but it's also of the societal impact in a broader sense.
So, for example, just kind of riffing off of what you said, in a country, say like Italy or Spain, where unemployment rate is a bit higher than Denmark, would you say that in that case, further education policies or more vocational training, even for older aged people, is necessary or should be borrowed as a policy?
Well, now we also need to be careful because there's a difference between looking at Greece compared to Portugal, compared to Italy, for example, and there the economies, the current economies, they are important. I mean, I can't give you the answer with regard to whether vocational. Vocational training would not solve the problems of those economies currently because the jobs are not there in those parts of Southern Europe. So it's not education that will solve those issues, but nevertheless, looking across Europe, yes, vocational training has not been a priority sufficiently in many parts of Europe, and you can see that the result of that.
Okay. And one last, substantial question, which is, one of the purpose of education systems is also to help us lead or help citizens lead subjectively meaningful and happy lives, which doesn't have to be economically beneficial or productive, right? And this is a thought experiment, but say we take that argument to the extreme and say, if the majority of people in our economy gets a lot of happiness from making coffee or pondering the meaning of life, just sitting there pondering, should government step in to correct that and say the majority of people must be doing quote unquote economically productive work and forget about what's subjectively what's subjectively happy to them?
So I think I think that
not that I agree with this, but I mean it's a thought experiment. Yeah.
So certainly we need to think about our economies and what makes us have effective economies, as well as a population with a high level of well-being. So that could be being happy, whether you are happy about your work or your family situation, your private situation. All of those elements are of course a combination and differs for across individuals. We are getting to a point in Scandinavia now where we have a lot of debates about 4-day work weeks. We have a lot of debates of younger generations not wanting to come in and step into leadership positions because of the pressure and the stress that can entail. And I think that that's problematic. Of course, we cannot all be making coffee and be happy with making coffee. We need to have a whole variety of job profiles, but also that there are people taking leadership roles and that and working 5 days a week or have other flexible working patterns. So I think it's not useful to say that we can all just think about the happiness. That's a luxury that very few people can afford. And of course, decision makers, politicians, and decision makers in general must consider the kind of economies and the supply into the labor market, but also, of course, what kind of healthy labor markets we can design in terms of the work life. So here we have a big debate about not just employment, but about your work life. People don't stay in the same job all their lives any longer, and of course, what we educate to is not one kind of job from the universities. It is to have hopefully a fulfilling work life throughout your career.
Great. And also, I mean, just a personal opinion, I think this country can learn a lot about happiness from the Danes. But
It's
okay,
the happiest country.
it is the happiest country in the world, yeah. But to cap this interview off, can you briefly talk about your latest research and what you're working on to readers in Oxford?
Yes, so I work on European politics, and I work on government negotiations, so the EU government's negotiations over in policy making. Sadly, I'm not doing too much research at the moment. I do what I can, but I am running a faculty of social sciences.
Yeah.
So we have 5 institutes: political science, economics, anthropology, sociology, and psychology, and that's in itself a big job. So research is at the moment, when when time allows, but I'm mainly focused on the government negotiations in the EU, and how that relates to national politics and national parliaments.
Amazing. So more of the policy advocacy work now, and more of the admin work.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah. So thanks a lot for that interview. That was very, very insightful. We discussed a lot of topics. And yeah, it's just wonderful to have you here and sit down and chat about this. Yeah.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It was really interesting to talk to you.